Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture hosted by the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Asmaret Askedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center, and I'll be your host today. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Joel Wuthnow, and his lecture is titled PRC, Thinking on Strategic Deterrence and Implications for Cross-Strait Stability. The lecture will provide insights into how Beijing and its People's Liberation Army are employing strategic deterrence as a means of reducing the likelihood of U.S. intervention in a future cross-strait conflict. Joel is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the National Defense University. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and has published a collection of books and papers on Chinese military affairs. Later on, Katie will put a link to one of his papers in the chat. In terms of the format, Joel will take about 30 to 45 minutes to speak, and then we'll use the remaining time for the Q&A session. You can start raising your hands electronically and typing your questions into the chat while Joel is speaking. With that said, Joel, welcome to CGSR. Thank you for speaking with us, and over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Asmaret, for the kind introduction. Thanks also to Brad Roberts, who asked me to come and talk about a topic that I've been thinking about a bit of late for the last couple of years or so, which has to do with what PLA and especially kind of senior PRC leaders are talking about when they use the language of strategic deterrence. It's rhetoric, it's discourse we've heard increasingly in Chinese security circles, from PLA officers, and even in fact from Xi Jinping himself. So it's a great chance to kind of think through some of these issues and to tell you what I've been thinking about since kind of the end of 2022. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to brief sort of two papers that are related to this topic and related to each other, although slightly distinct as well. One of which has been published. Thanks for sticking that in the chat. That's a Brookings piece from last year, sort of interpreting Xi Jinping's own remarks on strategic deterrence. And then the second piece is forthcoming, but it has more to do with what strategic deterrence means for kind of PLA thinking on counterintervention against the United States, specifically in a Taiwan contingency, and what that means in terms of giving perhaps the PLA a new idea or theory of victory in that particular contingency. All right, so in terms of, sort of the first piece, this is, the background of this is at the 20th Party Congress. So this was towards the end of 2022. Xi Jinping gave a very long and meandering speech, but part of which was related to sort of the modernization of the PLA. In that part of the speech, I mean, this was a huge speech, like once every 5 years, kind of a milestone speech for him to give. He mentioned the specific language was he encouraged the PLA to build a strong system of strategic deterrence. And that was noteworthy for analysts because he hadn't used that formula before. He had been around for 10 years as chairman of the Central Military Commission, the general secretary of the CCP. He hadn't uttered these words before. And so a lot of people were pondering, well, what exactly is he talking about? The context was also important there because this was towards the end of 2022. So this was about 6 months or so after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A lot of folks were wondering whether Taiwan might be next and whether or not when Xi is talking about strategic deterrence, he's nodding specifically in the direction of a plan, perhaps by, let's say, 2027, to be more prepared. And is strategic deterrence part of that particular calculation to prepare the PLA to deter the United States in the context of a PLA military campaign against Taiwan in the next several years? So it raised a lot of eyebrows. That being said, he didn't explain what he meant. He just simply said, let's build a strong system of strategic deterrence. And so it was kind of left to outsiders and to people in China to try to make heads or tails of what he was implying. So in the piece for Brookings, I went through kind of three different possibilities for the connotations of Xi Jinping's remarks there at the Party Congress. And so I kind of used figurative language to kind of give you a sense of what this means. So the piece is titled Shield, Sword, or Symbol. Okay, so these are three different interpretations of Xi's meaning, his emphasis. So the first one of these has to do with a shield. And so this idea is essentially that Xi Jinping was talking about the United States in particular. He is saying that over the preceding several years, the United States had become more antagonistic towards China. Perhaps China's strategic assessment of US intentions towards China had evolved. This was the time frame in which the USR strategy had pivoted, of course, towards great power competition in 2017, in 2018, under the National Defense Strategy, and related to that, the nuclear, proliferation, the nuclear posture review, and other such things. So perhaps elite Chinese thinkers were saying that the United States' intentions were becoming more malicious. Perhaps he was anticipating that U.S. support for Taiwan was becoming more ironclad back under the Trump and Biden administration. And so he's encouraging the PLA to build a much stronger strategic arsenal in order to deter the United States from wanting to meddle in China's affairs, in particular across the Taiwan Strait, and maybe in other regional contingencies as well. Part of the connotation in this interpretation also has to do with the modernization of US nuclear forces, and perhaps Xi Jinping is instructing his own rocket force and other strategic services to be more capable, so that the United States does not gain confidence in its ability to conduct nuclear intimidation against China in any kind of US-China conflict. But the idea, though, is that this is sort of a shield that he's trying to build around China, so that the United States is not able to meddle in or disrupt China's internal affairs, to include and especially the process of unification across the Taiwan Strait. So that's the idea of a shield. It's also related to the idea, and I'll kind of give a shout out here to my colleague Phil Saunders and his co-author David Logan, who are trying to understand the drivers of China's nuclear modernization. And one of the ideas they come up with is that part of the nuclear expansion that's occurring right around this time frame, sort of 2021, 2022, and of course it's continuing on to today, is to build sort of a nuclear shield around China, so that they don't have to fear as much about A, US nuclear intimidation of China, and then B, US conventional intervention in any particular contingency that the PLA engages in. So that's the idea of a shield. The sword is a broader idea. So this references more PLA discussions on strategic deterrence. And so the idea of strategic deterrence, or generally Weisha for the PLA, it goes back quite a lot longer, prior to 2022. So PLA authors have been discussing or kind of building out the idea of strategic deterrence really since the 1990s. Those discussions are much broader than great power competition or even nuclear deterrence and nuclear intimidation. So when PLA authors are talking about strategic deterrence, really what they are saying is we want to have a robust set of conventional and nuclear capabilities, not only to deter our opponents, but also to be able to kind of shape the battlefield or to coerce or compel our components to do what we want them to do. So this is not really deterrence as Tom Schelling defines it. This is much a broader concept that Schelling would call coercion. So it has both deterrent and compellent functions to it. So it's kind of a mistranslation to call Jianwei Weisha strategic deterrence. And so in this part of the paper, I say, well, we might actually just call this strategic coercion. And so that could be relevant to a Taiwan contingency, if you're talking about kind of large-scale strategic coercion of Taipei, but it's also relevant to other regional disputes that China is engaged in. So in some of the PLA discussions on strategic deterrence, you could actually have low-tech military capabilities, such as Coast Guard ships, using strategic coercion against other regional antagonists. And so this is interesting because, right around the time when I was writing this piece last year, China had been engaged in this kind of maritime standoff against the Philippines at a small reef in the South China Sea called Second Thomas Shoal. And they were using Coast Guard ships to basically block the resupply of the Filipino outposts. But that's the type of example that PLA authors gave when they're talking about sort of their own understanding of what strategic deterrence or strategic coercion entails. And so it's broad enough to encompass those high-end contingencies. So for example, let's use like nuclear intimidation to keep the US out of a Taiwan fight, but it's also broad enough to encompass sort of low-level, we might call it gray zone coercion against other territorial rivals without any use of lethal force. And so when Xi Jinping says this in 2022, he might be giving a nod to the PLA, not only to be prepared for a challenge from the United States, but also just simply to be better at shaping the security environment in a way that advances China's interests. And so then the last frame that we can use to explain Xi Jinping's thinking is more as a symbol. And so here I'm not talking in terms of strategic analysis at all. Here I'm talking about bureaucratic analysis. And so you have to kind of understand here the bureaucratic code language that senior CCP leaders use sometimes when they reference different institutional interests inside the PLA. And so when we hear strategic deterrence from Xi or from senior PLA generals, oftentimes what they're kind of subtly referring to is the PLA rocket force in particular. The rocket force, of course, is the force of the PLA that is responsible for China's land-based nuclear deterrent, as well as their land-based, ballistic missile force. So what they're kind of suggesting is that this is a force that needs to grow. It needs resources. Even in a period of sort of belt tightening and downsizing of the PLA, which happened under Xi Jinping's tenure, there are certain interests in the PLA that have to be preserved and expanded. And so perhaps what he's sort of suggesting to the PLA is, I'm going to kind of subtly call you out and say, we're going to protect your equities. So your funding, your programs, your modernization, and that's not going to be touched as part of further reforms of the PLA. So those are three different ways of thinking about what Xi Jinping has referenced when he uses the language of strategic deterrence, not necessarily mutually exclusive from each other, but different ways of kind of understanding some of the different levels in which just simply a phrase in an otherwise very long and anodyne party speech could give a sort of tip of the hat to some of the PLA's important priorities kind of slated for the next 5 years. Remember, the next 5 years at that vantage point is from the 20th Party Congress in 2022 all the way up to the 21st Party Congress in 2027, right? And so 2027, of course, is a key date for the PLA. So there's been a lot of discussion, rumination, speculation about what exactly this means for their military modernization. And so it's sort of a pivot to the second paper, which has to do with what is strategic deterrence in some sort of form of its meaning. What does it imply for China's game plan for Taiwan out to and perhaps beyond 2027? And so here I'm going to kind of back up a little bit and lay a bit of context before getting specifically into strategic deterrence as a potential option for the PLA. The first thing I want to say about this is that for the PLA, any major military operation related to Taiwan, whether it's a blockade, whether it's sort of a large-scale missile bombardment of the island that kind of protracts, whether it's a large-scale island landing, the critical variable, I think, for the PLA from a military perspective is whether and how effectively the United States can intervene on Taiwan's behalf. I say that because the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait itself has changed. It shifted very firmly in China's direction without the hope, without the possibility of this intervention. Maintaining a defense in a protracted campaign or assault by the PLA would be extremely difficult for Taiwan on its own. And so for that reason, for many, many years, and this is not recent, this goes back arguably to the late 1990s, thinking through the question of how exactly the PLA should try to avoid, prevent, or handle a US intervention, that's been a critical issue for them. All right, so that being said, though, there is not just simply one option, right, to kind of keep the US out of the fight. So part of this paper kind of lays a bit of the groundwork for the menu of options that the PLA has at its disposal to try to frustrate or to prevent or avoid or negate the prospects of effective US intervention on Taiwan's behalf. And so just kind of to concisely lay those things out, there's really kind of four possibilities here. So the first possibility is a direct military counter to the United States. And that's in Department of Defense circles. This is typically what we understand as system destruction warfare. So the idea is that the PLA conventionally will seek at the outset of a campaign to try to deny the US the ability to intervene by means of actually targeting, whether kinetically or non-kinetically, key nodes or centers of gravity in the US operational system. So you can think, for example, non-kinetically about cyber attacks on US military systems, or perhaps reversible effects on US space-based sensing or communications platforms. You could also think kinetically, and this obviously gets the most press attention, but kinetically would be something like long-range missile strikes against US logistics hubs in the Western Pacific, US air bases, even at the extreme, perhaps US aircraft carriers. So in other words, the key links, the major nodes in the US operational system. But that's just sort of a blunt force. We're going to physically make it impossible for you to successfully intervene in a time frame and at a scale that would make a difference. So that sort of system destruction warfare, and a lot of the US thinking on sort of intervention takes that as the starting point and says, well, how do we operate in a contested environment? So that's the first and most well-known of the PRC's counter-intervention options. But there are kind of three others as well. One other would be to not hit the US directly, but to kind of go after the host nations. So whether it's political, economic, or military, to use tools of coercion against especially Japan, but also against the Philippines, Australia, the Republic of Korea, and potentially any others who might, try to give support for US troops in a Taiwan contingency. And so to try to make it impossible, in other words, for the US to enjoy access, basing, overflight from any of those territories. And without, positions on the first island chain, it becomes harder, although not impossible, for the US to stage an intervention. So that'd be another possibility. A third would be sort of a fait accompli attack. So this idea would be, let's not directly engage US forces, but let's try to, in some way, attack at a speed, at a scale that is so fast, that's like a blitzkrieg style attack, that the US is not going to be able to fully mobilize, or perhaps not able to make the political decision to mobilize in the first place. So we're going to kind of do what maybe Putin intended to do back in February 2022, which was to roll across borders very quickly, topple the regime, get it all over and done with. And then part of this game plan might be some level of strategic surprise, to the extent that the PLA is reducing its mobilization timeframes, increasing the size and the scale of military exercises to perhaps a cloud, foreign perceptions of their intentions. And so whether or not they can do that, that is a potential option for them. A very high risk option, just as a attack against the United States directly would be high risk as well. Because indeed the US might be able to intervene and stop them, and they would not have full air and maritime superiority if they try to do this under, under covert means. It would be impossible for them to do that, because they'd have to take out the potential air and maritime threats to their landing forces, which they wouldn't be able to do and maintain surprise. So that's another option for them. The last, and for our purposes today, most relevant kind of counter-intervention option is what I call, or what they would potentially call as well, sort of strategic deterrence, okay? And so this kind of, as I go back to the first part of the discussion today, this is more, sort of relevant towards the United States in particular. So this is sort of strategic deterrence relevant to high-end PLA operations. In this particular context, which is, countering US intervention in Taiwan contingency, strategic deterrence basically has to do with creating a very high political risk, and also broader than that, strategic risk for the United States. So here I have to unpack what they consider as relevant to strategic deterrence. So this is not just nuclear, okay? So this is not saying, if you conventionally intervene, with Taiwan, we're going to start like nuking Washington. No, it's not. That wouldn't be a credible threat. That's not mainly what they're talking about. There probably is some level of consideration of nuclear signaling that would be relevant to this. And so I would suggest that they are paying rather close attention to what President Putin was able to do, or appeared to be able to do, in Ukraine in the early part of 2022, which was to use various nuclear signals to try to dissuade NATO from intervening in Ukraine, from a PRC perspective that seem to have worked reasonably well. And so under a strategic deterrence concept in a Taiwan contingency, you would fully anticipate that they would do certain things such as raising the nuclear alert status, such as conducting SNAP exercises or bomber patrols, to try to create doubt and uncertainty about the potential escalation of the conflict in Washington. But it's broader than just nuclear as well. And so here I'll kind of pause and give you the full definition of what PLA authors define as the scope of strategic deterrence, okay? So it is nuclear, that's always listed first in their discussions of strategic deterrence, but it's not just that. So just as in the United States, we talk about sort of integrated deterrence as much broader than just nuclear, PLA authors also talk about kind of 4 other categories. So the first would be a conventional. So in other words, conventional deterrence. Here in particular, if you're talking about a deterrent campaign at the outset of a Taiwan conflict, some of the conventional capabilities that would be relevant or would have deterrent value would include things like their ICBM range conventionally tipped missiles, or potentially their fractional orbital bombardment system, which could have a conventional payload-oriented missile set as well. Conventional missiles that could potentially target U.S. aircraft carriers. So those are not just warfighting armaments, but those are also tools of potential strategic deterrence. Beyond the conventional, they break out specifically cyber and space as categories of strategic deterrence. So from the cyber point of view, clearly what they're trying to do or would do in this particular contingency would be to say, look, not only can we potentially compromise U.S. military networks, but we can also create pretty severe damage to U.S. critical infrastructure at home in the United States. Now, they're not going to say specifically what that is, but you can imagine that can include things like the transportation sector. That could include things like the energy sector. It could include, telecommunications. And of course, we know that they have left some traces of their hacking of our critical infrastructure, perhaps to give a nod in this particular direction to say, look, we would like general stability between the United States and China. However, if you cross our red lines, if you interfere in our core interests, in other words, specifically, if you intervene on behalf of Taiwan, there are many different things we can do to really jam you up. And cyber is a significant part of that arsenal. So that is considered from their point of view to be part of the overall rubric of strategic deterrence. Fourth would be space, and in particular, counter space weapons. And so as we know, they have developed all manner of reversible and irreversible counter space weapons to be able to hold at risk. Again, not only military satellites and sensing and communications and so on, but also civil use, so GPS and so on. So that could also be part of their threat or coercion. And then the last one, which might actually be the hardest to explain or to understand, because we don't exactly think in these terms here in the US, but it's what they would call people's war deterrence. And so again, it's a subcomponent of strategic deterrence, people's war deterrence. So what exactly does that mean? What this has to do with is sort of suggesting to your opponent that your people will fight very hard. Okay, so this is about demonstrating national resolve at the popular level. What they're trying to suggest here is that the Chinese people, if asked to sacrifice on a matter of high national interest, they have the history, they have the temperament and the attitude to sacrifice indefinitely. They will accept whatever attrition is necessary. They will suffer whatever cost to their economy and their lifestyle is necessary to see through a potentially very protracted and very bloody conflict, because they have this very high level of resolve. They would occasionally try to demonstrate this particular form of deterrence in something like mobilization exercises of the PLA. And in fact, the mobilization part of the PLA has sort of started to brand themselves as a force for strategic deterrence, right? So it seems a little bit odd to think of the mobilization system as a deterrent system. But from the Chinese perspective, they regard their ability to mobilize, to harness civilian willpower, civilian energy, civilian industry to support a much larger war effort, and to broadcast a message to their opponents to say that, you try to get into a fight with us, you may bloody our nose at the very beginning, but we are going to keep at this at tremendous cost to ourselves, but we will weather that cost more than you will because we are intrinsically far more committed to this fight. So strategic deterrence in this Taiwan context would be bringing all of these subcomponents together into a single focused message underscored by particular capabilities for the PLA, and to focus that message not really on DoD or to the warfighters or to the operational people, but to focus that message onto the political elite in the United States, the decision-making class, who would have to, under great duress, make a pivotal decision in the face of tremendous uncertainty and tremendous cost and risk, not only to U.S. forces in theater, but also potentially to the U.S. homeland, and to say, look, if you persist with mobilization, deployment, intervention, and especially if you start fighting us, then we are going to make your life very, very difficult, and to have credible ways to transmit that message at the outset of the crisis. And so I personally regard that as a separate theory of victory for the PRC in this particular contingency. This is not system destruction warfare. This is not, we're going to do a bolt out of the blue attack to neutralize your capabilities, to make it impossible for you to intervene. This is the PLA saying, we can't guarantee victory if we do that. The US has all sorts of different capabilities they can throw at us. They have the undersea, the long range bombing, the drones. So system destruction warfare could fail. The other options, keeping host nations neutral, that's unreliable. Surprise attack, totally unreliable. But if you can focus this powerful message at US political decision makers who may not really want to intervene or be able to bear the cost of intervention, if you can transmit that message effectively towards the beginning of the crisis, then you're not going to draw the US in as you would if you actually attack them directly. You might be able to successfully deter them. And so I think this is an important implication of sort of PRC thinking on strategic deterrence. Again, it's not necessarily the essence of what Xi Jinping had in mind when he said this in 2022, but I think is one of the important potential manifestations of what he meant, and it's underscored and it's sort of built out by tremendous advances in PLA capabilities, obviously both on the nuclear side, on the strategic non-nuclear side, and on the conventional side. So again, I think a very important thing that we have to keep in mind when we're considering under what circumstances would the CCP leadership tolerate any kind of conflict across the Taiwan Strait. One of the reasons for a confidence for a decision to do that might be optimism in this idea that the US is something of a paper tiger. And so I should also say that strategic deterrence complements and kind of coincides with a larger political discourse in China on the US as sort of a withering great power. This is, the roots of this go back to at least 2008 or so. Rush Doshi talks about this in his book, but the America in Decline thesis, that the US is sort of starting to kind of bust at the seams. We are poorly, we are debt ridden. The military readiness has declined. US political polarization is so high that, you can't do anything. So all these sorts of things together, that's part of the larger package. But when you have that, that's sort of like, an open door that strategic deterrence would push on to give senior CCP leaders confidence that they can more or less just pick up the phone and dial Washington and say, you had better not test us. We're doing this. Don't get involved or else. And maybe have some optimism that that could actually work. So the ending of the piece is to say, well, what do we do about this? And so I think, my first point here would be, let's not overstate the problem. I don't think this idea has gained, full currency in senior PRC circles as of right now. I think the expectation is still basically that the US will intervene, that there would be bipartisan support in the United States for intervention, and that the US has credible military options to intervene. Therefore, any attempt to deter would be risky at best. So I don't see a strong level of consensus that this particular theory of victory as of right now is viable. What I would worry about over the next 5 years would be a kind of almost magical thinking in China that there could be an embrace of this in the absence of contradictory signals that perhaps the US really, is a paper tiger, and that the PLA has modernized, especially its strategic capabilities, to the point that you can have this powerful, sort of stick that you can force against that open door, and that would be an idea that is very well embraced by Xi Jinping and others in those elite circles. So I worry about that. I worry about groupthink, and that maybe perhaps Xi Jinping is not getting alternative sources of analysis that would push back against that. So I worry over time that he could be more risk acceptance if he comes to believe in this theory of victory, but I don't see that as the present day reality. I continue to kind of assess that Xi Jinping and his colleagues are relatively risk averse. They tend to fear the unknown. The PLA cannot guarantee victory. The PLA is known to Xi Jinping to be highly corrupt as of right now. And so I'm not sort of an alarmist on this front, but I do think of this as a potential reason to worry about the long-term trajectory, and so therefore what to do about this. Well, I think this kind of starts with the maintenance of high-level U.S.-China dialogue, both to take the temperature of sort of people in the CCP. What are they thinking about? What are they talking about? To understand where they are, but then also especially to send the message that this probably is not going to work. One reason being that Taiwan, in terms of U.S. national interest, is not the same thing as Ukraine. So if Putin was able to do this, Taiwan is a totally different case for the United States, just from this point of view of national interest. And secondly, that if you try to do this, and especially if you start to play with strategic capabilities, there are pretty profound escalatory risks to that. So, for example, if you start, lighting off cyber effects in the continental United States, then let's just see what's going to happen in mainland China, and maybe you didn't quite anticipate that. And so if you value stability within China, if you value political security for the regime in China, you probably do not want to trifle with things as grave and as momentous as nuclear, space, and cyber. And so, what I want to do is to try to avoid in our strategic discussions with the PRC the prevention of any kind of what I would just call magical thinking. That strategic deterrence can be the kind of silver bullet, if you will, for successfully avoiding U.S. Intervention with Taiwan. So I'm going to stop there, and I will look forward to for your questions and your responses. Thank you very much.